Known for his down-to-earth, insightful commentary and critical perspectives on social and cultural issues, ranging leadership and identity development, intersectionality, race and ethnicity, knowledge production, and critical and inclusive pedagogy and practice in higher education. Dr. Benitez has authored book chapters and articles on student identity, hip hop culture, culture centers, cultural and ethnic studies, institutional research and campus climates, and faculty development. He is co-editor of the anthology Crash Course, Reflections on Film, Crash for Critical Dialogues about Race, Power, and Privilege, and has contributed to online magazines, scholarly databases, books, and journals. Dr. Benitez has been featured in educational documentaries such as Cracking the Codes, The System of Racial Inequity, and has appeared on talk shows such as Worlds Apart, Hard Knock Radio, and Speak Out with Tim Wise. Part of Dr. Benitez's success lies in his ability to speak heart to heart while bridging theory and scholarly inquiry with everyday life. His use of accessible language that multiple audiences can relate to, his deep knowledge in practice of innovative equity and inclusion-based strategies and approaches to address some of higher education's more pressing campus climate issues of today. Over the last 2 decades, Dr. Benitez has served higher education in different capacities, including academic and student affairs, diversity, equity and inclusion, EEO, and Title IX compliance, and teaching. Dr. Benitez has served as Director of Diversity Initiatives at Dickinson College, Director of Intercultural Development in the Black Cultural Center at Lafayette College, adjunct faculty in the Graduate School of Leadership and Professional Advancements at Duquesne University, Director of Intercultural Engagement and Leadership at Grinnell College, and Chief Diversity Officer, Dean of Diversity and Inclusion, and Title IX and EEO Officer at University of Puget Sound. Presently, he serves as Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion at Metropolitan State University of Denver. Dr. Benitez has completed both BS and MEd at Pennsylvania State University, where he gained interest in pursuing doctoral studies as a TRIO student and McNair Scholar, and holds a PhD in educational leadership and policy with a focus on social justice in higher education from Iowa State University School of Education. Dr. Benitez has been recognized with multiple leadership and scholarly awards throughout his career and continues to serve as one of higher education's leading and transformative change makers and DEI leaders. And just quickly before inviting Dr. Benitez to speak, I also want to add that in the 6 months that I've been working at MSU Denver, I've had the pleasure of witnessing the corazon Dr. Benitez has in fostering a culture centered on anti-racist work while navigating, complicating, and challenging the dominant structures that exist in academia. So without further ado, welcome Dr. Benitez.
Wow, Mary, thank you so very much for that lovely and always humbling introduction. So appreciative for your kind words. You know, I'm gonna try not to turn red here on screen, but just gratitude. And I wanna add, Kosio, thank you for the invitation to come and journey and partake with ya and chill with ya, chill productively with ya. And to everybody who has come out, thank you for trusting me with your time. This is one of the organizations, among others, that are really near and dear to my heart. When you put Latinx people and education in the same sentence, it's like putting race and pedagogy in the same sentence. These are things that are real near and dear to me, particularly given my background and given sort of where I'm at and what I do. And then, so let me get this started on a formal note, but expressing my deep gratitude and appreciation. First, let me introduce myself in my native tongue. Usawayu Watyao Diri Mike Benitez of Afro-Taino Arawak descent, son of the island of Borinquen, now known as Puerto Rico, and acknowledgement and gratitude to the Cheyenne Arapaho people to the Utes who also traveled here in Comanche and many others. It's so important that we not only acknowledge, but truly recognize the mendings that still need to happen with respect to the spaces that we feel and how we exist, and how we try to collaborate and reckon with those histories and moving into forward generations. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Joel, gratitude as well. It's always a pleasure to see you, and appreciating the love that's right there on the chat already. So, you know, Trio, yes, I was Trio and Upward Bound and CSP, and I was a McNair Scholars. You know, all these programs that people try to down, but really these programs are wraparound intentional spaces that offer possibilities and opportunities for us to keep it real and be us and be authentic and show up with a sense of not only we can make it, but this is mine already. So how do I step into reclaiming what's mine? Gratitude. I do have a presentation I'm about to put up soon here in 2-3 minutes. I am going to engage with you interactively. So there are going to be some moments I'm going to pause, and I'm going to ask you to also to go ahead and use the chat, particularly to engage with me. And I also encourage emotion. So anytime you're like feeling something, anytime that you're like, that really hits and resonates, please, you know, put it on there. And I really like the idea of bringing everybody's voices into the lecture itself. So today, you know, I really want to talk about Latinx, where we're at, particularly in the age of COVID, but also at the intersection of race and ethnicity. I'm going to throw a little bit of history, critical history, not revisionist history. And then I'm going to kind of bring that to the forefront and really talk about what that means for us today. So let me start off quick with a little story. You know, it's interesting because I was born in Puerto Rico and then I moved to New York. And when I moved to New York, and this was back in the 70s, 80s, obviously, you know, I didn't have to really, I wasn't forced to learn English because I moved to Washington Heights. Everybody there already talked Spanish. So I just continued to talk Spanish. It wasn't until I moved to Pennsylvania that I had my Bruce Willis moment. I don't know if y'all familiar with The Sixth Sense. That movie with the little kid who sees the ghost, but you don't know that Bruce Willis is a ghost all the way to the end. But I had my Sixth Sense moment, right? When I moved to PA, it was like the first time that I truly was surrounded by this majority that wasn't me. And I had that reaction. I was like, oh my God, they do exist, blancos, right? And it's not to say that in a bad way, it's to say that it hits you. It hits you when you join a community that all of a sudden you're not the norm. You know, you're not sort of the person that kind of drives culture, or whose culture is centered in the way that we engage and interact and chill with each other. And it was at that point that I really started to begin to see, right, that there's this, you know, at that time it was Hispanic. That's the word that was used. And, you know, I didn't know any better. I didn't start to really claim Latino. And again, without the X, right? It's so important to mark those moments until really probably the late 80s, early 90s. But by that time, I had already started to problematize Hispanic before I even got to college. Like, what does this really mean? How do I fit? How does that deny my indigenous ancestry, but also my indigenous practice and who I am as a person? But then even further down the road, I also started to see the way that both Hispanic and Latinx really didn't honor and excluded the term Black or Afro or African. And even though so much of the cultural practice in Puerto Rico, it's African, it's West African, from the names to the cultural practice, it's so taboo. And so many people all the time, they're like, no, I'm Taino, or no, I'm Blanco, or no, I'm this, or I'm Latino, or Hispanic, or Chicano, or, you know, we could come up with a bunch of different sort of categories, none of which were constructed by us, right? But at the end of the road, it was important for me to also really step into my Afro-Taino identity and really claim that Blackness, really claim my indigeneity by way of practice, but also understand the neo-colonial a cultural practice of even talking Spanish, or mad Latinx people who practice Catholicism. Nothing wrong with it. Let me be clear about that. But it is marked. It is situated somewhere. There are consequences. It does mean something, and that something is significant, right? So with that said, I'm going to put up this press. I'm going to take you through this. I'm going to ask some questions, have you engage in some dialogue, but let's get this popping and on the road. So excuse me here as I put this presentation up. All right, now let me go back. Does this, oh, there we go. All right. So I just need to know, can everybody see that? Yeah?
Yes, we can.
All right, let me go ahead and put the full screen. And can everybody see that?
I can.
Word. I appreciate that thumbs up, bro. I appreciate that thumbs up. So let's go ahead and begin here, because it matters, right? It matters not only within the context of Denver, Colorado, within the state of Denver, within the US, but even on a global scale, it also matters because we are part of this particularity, this moment, this complexity in a very certain way that is just nuanced and complex and not as obvious as people try to give it the time in order for us to better step into understanding what this looks like. So I always start off with a quote from one of my favorite authors, Linda Twighe Smith, Decolonizing Methodologies. And it says, the very idea of post-colonial spaces is layered with and evocative of empires past, present, and future, complicated stories and identities, intimate and alienated relationships, shifting borders and contested terrains, ambivalent, partial, and contradictory meanings. Within these spaces, people live and make sense of their lives. They occupy shifting spaces. They shift the spaces they occupy, and yet the spaces are the same spaces that existed before. Right? And that really speaks when I think about Colorado and the whole idea of it once being Mexico, or Mexico at one point not being Mexico, being a solely indigenous land that was colonized by the Spanish and then turned into, Mexico. And then I think about a moment like the Treaty of Guadalupe, where that whole negotiation, took place between the US and Mexico. But I can't, it is a state like Colorado that makes so clear what this space is and who this space belongs to, right? Like when I talk to a lot of Latinx people here, they go back not just, third generation, four generations. I mean, you have folks here whose families never moved, who literally the borders crossed them. Like one day it's like, yeah, yo vivo en Mexico. And the next day it was like, ¿Cómo que yo vivo en los Estados Unidos? you know? And that in itself just created a very different way of what moving forward looks like. But you also have to add then the indoctrination, right? The forceful sort of, you can't speak Spanish no more. Now we're the US, we're not Mexico no more. So we have to practice in a certain way. You have to identify in a certain way. Except color mattered at that time too. When you look at history, Mexicanos who identified or who appeared as blanquitos, very Spaniard looks, they were able to really step into that Eurocentrism in a way that, dark-skinned mestizos or Black Mexicans were not able to really step in there. They couldn't just one day be like, oh, today I'm going to be this. Like for me, like I can't just show up in a space and be like, today I just don't want to be brown. Today I'm going to be white and I'm going to walk the world. No, people me van a ver like, vete loco. Right? And that's how they're going to react. And so it's so important. But the other piece in framing this, I really love this quote by Sotomayor is, she goes on to say at a very particular time, I will hope that a white Latina woman with the richness of her experiences will more often than not reach a better conclusion than a white male who hasn't lived that life. And while this can go, in different directions, what I'm appreciating about what she's saying here is self-authorship, it's self-determination. Like, at what point can all the different identities within the Latinx culture actually own their narrative and not have other people define that narrative for us? And even myself, I identify as Afro-Taino Boricua, right? But I identify as Latinx as a political identity. So I'm very particular that my identity is one grounded in the politics of imperial construction and neocolonialism. That is not my racial and ethnic identity, but I still claim it and own it because it has real consequences, because there's real significance behind it, and because there's power in collective movement. Like we see right now with the elections. Yeah, things, and I'll talk about this later, things in Florida and Texas by way of elections, folks are like, whoa, how did he get more support from Latinx in those states? But then we have places like Arizona and Georgia where we're seeing that shift, where we're seeing that Latinx people really came out in big numbers to kind of put a stamp on who we are and how we show up. But part of this requires us to not just be honest, but to be nice. I always put this one up because I always like to play with this one because, so often we're like, if we have civil and respectful dialogue and conversation, then we should have no issue at getting blah, 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 right? And my thing is, we also know that when we push against power and when we push against dominance and when we try to assert our own authorship and not let somebody else define who we are, that causes issues in the dominant white supremacist community. Now, I'm not talking about white supremacy, the violence that we're seeing out there. I'm talking about the epistemic grounding and violence that is actually white supremacist, the norm. Who gets to construct knowledge? Who gets to be at the center? And who are we comparing ourselves to? And how come are we not putting ourselves at the center of all the work that we do within the context of not just society, but particularly educational spaces? Like, why is it that Chicano studies or ethnic studies or Latinx studies as a byproduct of this history that we teach? And why can we see that as central? It should be a central way of looking at the way that we live and practice. I also have found Denver to be a little bit like Washington, or just Colorado to be a little bit like Washington, where when honest meets nice, tension builds. It's like, well, then why are you getting so mad at me? I'm just being honest, but I'm also being nice. And no matter how nice honest is, it's like all of a sudden nice ain't nice anymore. It's almost like we can't take that even somebody that talks like this and really respectfully, and I'm not screaming and I'm keeping the same tone todo el tiempo, all the time, you're still telling me I'm yelling. You're still telling me that I'm like angry or going off a hook. But here's the reality for who we are in the US. And let me just, pop up some demographics right quick, right? We're at this place where we are literally, right, such a large part of the population, a fifth to be exact. And we're going to have a better idea once the census count numbers come out. But this gives us a lot of power, a lot of it migratory, a lot of it was already here, and incredible diversity within these. However, let me also be clear that over the last several years, as a result of the current administration and as a result of the ways in which this nation has moved forward with the politics of identity, that there's actually been more migrant citizens, undocumented citizens, or even Latinx who are citizens move out of the US than actually come in by way of a pattern. And a lot of folks don't pay attention to that, right? So back to the whole thing of they say that they're building a wall because too many of us enter illegally and won't learn their language or assimilate into their culture. And what this makes me think about beyond the indigenous element of this is this. Why is it that when a lot of people visit a place like Mexico, they go over there, they check into the hotel, they're about to go to the beach, all that, and then they make this comment. They're like, I can't believe no one speaks English here. It's like, oh, for real? Damn, like you wouldn't have thought to maybe just like I don't know, learn like a couple words in Spanish, like hola, me llamo. But no, even when folks from here travel elsewhere, they still want everyone to speak English. And it's an interesting, it goes back to that center, that expecting their norm to be the norm of the world, right? And now back to the history, I really love this particular comic because it really defines a lot of our experiences. I thought your people celebrated Black History Month, Black History in the month of February, and the homie is like, nope, that month is for y'all. We celebrate all year long, which is the way that we also show up when folks are like October, September, Latinx History Month, Hispanic Heritage Month. And I'm like, yo, I'm this all year long. I celebrate this all year long. What are you talking about, right? But this goes back to the erasure, the absence, and the decentering of our experiences, our histories, and our lived realities and the context of this place. So let me ask everyone here a question, okay? And the question that I want to ask is, what does it mean to be Hispanic or Latino, Latina, Latinx to you? Please use the chat. What does this mean to you? I'm seeing all the commentary, coming in here, and all of you are so on point and so right on. So, what does it mean to be Latinx to you? You go ahead and type that out in the chat if you feel comfortable. What does this mean? This word, this ever shifting, evolutionary word, to be a part of my family, to be part indigenous, part Spanish colonizer, marginalized but up and coming, perseverance, member of the borderlands, always will exist in the borderlands indeed, both in the physical and the ideological, connected to my roots, ancestral connections, our values and beliefs, right? Our cultura. What are some others? The child of immigrants who sacrificed everything, being authentic and not being ashamed of who I am, celebrating who I am, political power, strength, sharing my culture. Those are all so real, and I'm appreciating what you're, throwing in there so much because it's all true, right? And yet, we have to also wrestle with what does all that mean, and to whom, and how do we look at this, particular understandings? Oh, I love that one, chingona. Yeah, my partner, my queen, she uses that all the time. Is one of my favorite words, right? So thank you, post-colonial language masters. And I'm going to break down post-colonialism later on because I like to reframe it in a way that brings the postmodern and try to and really kind of make that practical, right? And preserving hablando español, yes. And I'm going to also interrogate that one too, right? Because español has a very particular politic and identity in there. Or maybe I'll give the example now as you're kind of everyone's chiming in, right? Like sometimes folks will come to me and they'll be like, hey, your son speaks Spanish, but he's not like super fluent like you are. And so what does that mean? And is he really Latino if he doesn't speak Spanish, right? And the answer is, whether it's English or Spanish, they're both colonial tones. They're both colonial dialects. When I think about language, I think about Arawak, or I think about Nahuatl, or I think about those original tongues and languages, right? So it's important to know Spanish, and it's important to know English, and even more so Spanish, but it's because we need it for cultural capital gain, meaning, right? That means that we cannot ever truly understand the way we were colonized unless we read the discourse, the colonizing papers, like the Christopher Columbus that were written, and Cortez and others that were written in Spanish, because that gives us direct access to understanding how things happened, right? So it's about the access. It's about the access to our roots, the access to who we are, right? but it's still important. So I don't want to minimize that because it's still part of this evolution of identity and this ongoing mezcla of who we continue to become, right? And it all matters and it's all important. So let me go ahead and move on. And I'm really appreciating that dialogue, right? Because the Spanish does serve as this way of connecting, as this way even of assuring that there's an element of resistance to the way in which we operate in the context of Anglo-Eurocentrism. So there was a study done not long ago, and generally it asked people, went around and asked people, what does it mean to be Latinx to you, or that time Latino? And so, you know, in general, a summary of those responses that came about is family, connections, extended family, not just parents and tios and tias and abuelos and abuelas, but community members and influencers. We really think about family in the broadest way. Financial stability and literacy is so big for our communities in particular, right? Because so many of us don't grow up with that. And there's power in being okay with going after that and reclaiming what's ours, right? Consistency and structure, right? A way que las cosas deben de ser, right? A way of things happening that is how we do things. Integrity and respect, access and affordability. These are all important because of those histories. So let me take you through what some folks said that Latino means to them. This cat from Brazil said that when he was asked the question, Latino meant identity crisis. He's Brazilian, he's Ecuadorian, and I want to twist this because identity crisis doesn't have to be bad. Identity crisis could be a good thing, right? It's part of the struggle and the ongoing sort of growth that we're undertaking and the shift. Because for me, in this society today, to have multiple identities and personalities is what actually makes you, for me, the norm. When you're just one way and we can't shift according to context or different areas, then it's not going to work out. Like, let me give you an example. Like, you know, when we're chilling with our peoples and we're watching like un juego de fútbol in Spanish, like European football, soccer, right? Or for those of you who are like American football fans watching football, right? When we're with each other, we may go at it and argue, no, hell no, your team sucks and my team is the best because blah, 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 right? Will you talk like that in front of your mom? Will you like in front of like an elder and start cursing? No, the hell with that and F that, because no, man, your mom will pick up that chancla and will smack you upside the head with it, or she may just throw it at you like the boomerang that it is. And I know y'all know what that's about because I know y'all remember growing up and your abuela or mom picks up that chancla, she throws it at you, it hits you, you're like, damn, that hurt. And then you go try to find the chancla so you could hide them, but you can't find them. And when you look up, it's right back in your mom's hand, right? You get clapped up like that by that chancla. This person said, I am Spanish. Not all Latinas are from Mexico, but pay particular attention to the term Spanish that was used to identify who she is. Oh, and there we go. La chancla, right? This was when people ask me what Latinx means to me, this is what I say. I be like, you la chancla. Now, I'm traumatized, but I'm traumatized in a good way, okay? Soy Latina, Mexican, Panamanian, American, bicultural, bilingual. I am proud, right? So here, they began to complicate these even more. This person said, I'm Black and Cuban. My culture is faith, family, and hard work. So we're already also starting to see the way that Latinx doesn't just mean this race ethnicity. To be Latinx to a lot of people also means those cultural practice that we bring with us, right? Raza, unity. And I'm going to interrogate raza later on, but I also want to honor what it means in the context of the US in particular. This two said, one of them said, it means that I am Hispanic. It means that I need to help my children be the best they can be and represent us well. And what I want to point out there is this pressure we're put on ourselves. Like, you know, growing up, if you're like me and you grew up like me, my mom always used to like be like, Michael, tú tienes que stay humble, tú tienes que ser humilde, porque tú eres Latino. I'm like, oh, okay. So to be humble means to be Latino. Or a lot of Latinx elders I grew up with would say, you can never ever forget about your community. Why? Because you're Latinx. Or tienes que ser un trabajador y trabajar fuerte. Why? Because you're Latino, right? Like Latino was never exempt from this sort of just being Latinx. It was like connected to everything that we do, everything that we are, and all the ways that we show up. This here to the side, she says, I'm Dominican and my culture is merengue and sancocho and familia and dedication. So we started to see that pick up even more. Soy Chicana. My culture is split Mexican blood and American traditions. Right? That's so similar to my children. Yo soy Boricua, but I gotta be real. My son grew up in the US. So although he is, Boricua, he's Mexican, he's Latinx, he's also American in a way that I'm not, in a way that I don't quite or strongly identify. And that's okay too. And I think we have to start being okay with allowing all those multiplicities to exist. So let me get into a little bit of this history in particular. I don't want to go too much into it, but it's important to understand the Atlantic slave trade in particular, because what a lot of people don't know is that 92% of enslaved Africans were brought to the portal at the time that is now known as Colombia. And I want you to put those numbers, and I want you to just kind of reflect with that. Put those numbers in your head and really think about, okay, if 92% of all enslaved Africans came through the port that is now Colombia, and only 8% came otherwise, with about 6% coming through what is now Florida, Virginia, or the southeastern United States, and 2% maybe went through the Caribbean, but they didn't have to stay there very long because everyone got pretty much sort of killed off. With indigenous people there escaped the mountains with some enslaved people, and even some Spanish indentured servants who got their heads straight and decided to run off, hence why you have so much of the resistance and survival that we still present today. Then that begins to paint a picture for you of how barbaric Spanish colonial culture was in Latin America, that we still in many areas don't see the presence that reflects 92%. But when you look here, right, when you look here, you begin to see also where it took place in all these different countries. But important to understand about historicizing Latinidad is, if you look here to the left in particular, in the bottom, Latin comes from Latin comes from Latium. Latium is now Italy. Italy has nothing to do with Latin America. So when we say I prefer Latinx over Hispanic, what does that really mean? Like what does that really mean, right? Let's sit with that. It's nothing wrong with it, and it's more inclusive, and the X signifies a more inclusive version of what that could represent today, that goes beyond the inclusion of gender and accounting for gender non-binary cultures. The X also has to do with accounting for and recognizing the erasure of indigeneity. No different than Malcolm X, right, wore an X to help recognize that there's absence and erasure there, that he doesn't really have his real name because all that was stripped away from his ancestors. Latinx people are very similar, where so much has been stripped away about who we are. But it came to light in particular in Latin America because of a Chilean author by the name of Francisco Bilbao. And this was back in 1858, because Francisco, if I was to put it in like my own words today in a conversation, Francisco was like, yo, we're not as bad as the Anglo colonizers. We treat ours better. So how do we come up with a term? Because Hispanic and Spanish were so connected to barbarianism and incredible global violence that he was like, well, let's use Latin America because it's tied to the Romance languages in Latium. And that was like a way to switch and shift language to begin to represent a continent that before that was in Latin America. Right, so we begin to understand now where Latin or Latino, Latina, Latinx begins to originate from within the context of our culture. What I want to problematize by way of raza, right? And I'm going to talk about Hispanic next, is that raza and the work of Vasconcelos, hence why someone like a Gloria Anzaldúa kind of, stepped to him, or at least to his work, and was like, hey, homie, chill. I get that we are a third space and we're a cosmic space, but you're really leaving not only gender out, but you want to create a third space as its own space without the histories, right? It's like you just want to say somos mestizos, but you don't want to account for the indigenous colonizing, for the Spanish privileging, for the caste system, and the pigmentocratic or pigmentocracy that was created as a result, and why we deal with colorism and racism within our own communities so much. And I could talk about discourse. I grew up, and I remember my family saying, ay, qué trigueño, qué lindo, ay, que tiene ese color, que es como un marroncito, right? What I gathered from that eventually after formulating consciousness was, wow, you're kind of really telling me that if I would have been any darker, I wouldn't have been lindo. Or when people in this very same cultures, not just Puerto Rico, but across Latin America, encourage daughters to marry to marry lighter skinned men, or to marry even just white men, period, or to marry into lightness. Right? And we have all sorts of commentary. And so let me ask you right quick, what were some of the terms that you all heard growing up that reflect colorism, that reflect this sort of privileging towards light skin, and this sort of like demonizing, or this a sort of undesirable darker skin? What are some of the things in particular that you all grew up hearing? Please. Mejorando la raza, big one. Or te ves muy India. I mean, these are all, right? We grow up with these all the time, right? That he wished he would have married a white woman. In the same case, wish they would have married a white man, right? And so much of it so that they don't have to deal with the pain and the wounds and the trauma that we experience today, right? Everything compared to whiteness as the norm. Comments around white babies and colored eyes, absolutely, right? La guerrita, I mean, right? So what you're doing right now is you're highlighting and you're exposing this narrative of what we have to intentionally, collectively push back against, but we have to also collectively own. We have to collectively own, and in order to be able to challenge it, right? But even if you look at La Raza here, and I'll leave that in front of you, look what it says. La Raza was Hispanics included most Mexican, Central American, Caribbean, and South American peoples. And it included French-speaking Haitians, Portuguese-speaking Brazilians, and English-speaking Trinidadians. But it excluded indigenous people who have no African or European ancestors, and those of European ancestry living south of the US who have no African or Native American forebears. Under that construction, though, many US citizens descended from enslaved Africans brought to the US who also had some of those backgrounds. So when you begin to look at La Raza, now La Raza in the US very particularly means it's very political. It's about reclaiming power. It's about movement. It's about, you can't get rid of us. This is our land. And that's so righteous, but yet we also have to look at the meanings, the historical meanings of La Raza as in the way it was introduced by Vasconcelos, which was very Spanish white supremacist, right? And I throw that out to say that whiteness within the context of the US and Spain and the colonialism that, has created cousins. And it's why so many people from Latin America across all the different countries, when they move to the US, it's like visiting un primo that you haven't seen for a really long time. You're like, oh, primo, no te ha visto en como 7 años. I haven't seen you in 7 years, but it's like, I just saw you yesterday. Or it's like, I've never met you before, but it's like, I know you, right? That's that whiteness kind of talking a little bit beyond the culture. It's a way to identify within that space. So I throw out this history because so often we ignore this history and what it means. And so here we've then come through a progression from, oh, how do we identify them? How do we put them in boxes? This is hard because, you know, they look different. And we thought they were going to look the same because at the beginning, a lot of the Latinx people, or back in the day, Hispanic, if that even, looked the same by way of pigmentation. But then you move forward, you start diversifying the Latinx communities. Now we have brown, we have black, we have Cameroon, we have mulatto, we have Zumba, and I could go on and on about the like more than 100 categories that the Spanish caste system created that are also gendered and grounded in Marianismo. And if you're not familiar with Marianismo, look up the work of Marianismo because it's not only highly gendered, but it exposes the significance of how Spanish European white culture tried to create a box for the way women were supposed to behave and act and be, and what their place was, even to the extent that depending of the constructed gender of the person and the relationship will determine the power they have in society. Right? So then we start coming into the 70s, Spanish surname plus, Spanish speaking, and then it wasn't until 1980s that we actually got to Hispanic. But also important to know is the amount of the Latinx population or Hispanic at the time population that also identified as white. Now, that doesn't mean they're trying to be white. Let me be clear. It means that a lot of Latinx people are white. They identify as white. It doesn't make them any less Latinx. It doesn't make them any less of anything else. Those are all everything that they are. No different than if you're black and Latinx, it doesn't make you any less Latinx. You're just black and you're Latinx. But this term really began to come about through the Department of Health as a way, right, through this ad hoc committee, as a way to classify people. A lot of it tied to funds, but a lot of it also tied to the politics. A lot of the politics that we're actually seeing play out in this election that's going on right now. Right. And so the person who really started to bring up that term within the context of the US was Graciela Flores Hughes. Right. She's the one that not coined it, but coined it within the context of how do we mark and identify this community in the US. But they miss one big part, that Latinx people are more diverse than Americans. Like we're 525 years in. We've had a lot of time to be and become all sorts of different things, right? So when we think about Latinx, a lot of people also don't talk about Asian migrations to Latin America in the 1800s for resources. So Asia also plays a significant role in the construction of identities in Latin America, Peru, and Guatemala, and Chile, and Venezuela, because a lot of that was already present. So for us, we're like literally the ultimate multi-ethnic, multiracial being. So when we say Latinos, we might as well just say multi-ethnic, multiracial for 525 years. Now, when we think about this in the US, it's no wonder that you see the dark blue in front of you that you see, right? We're the majority of Latinx populations, right? I mean, with the exception of like Illinois and New York, you know, we had to roll there. That's just where people went, you know, whether it was Humboldt Park or whether it was Washington Heights. There's reasons why those migrations happened. You know, when I moved to Bethlehem, I found out that there's like 5-6 generations of Puerto Ricans in Bethlehem because of the Bethlehem steel industry. We also know that there's large migrations to Washington and even North Dakota because of the Bracero movement and a lot of this different, you know, sort of kind of economic, political needs of the US who went and got us because we're like dope at what we do. But then they didn't want to keep us. It's like right now, like how can Taco Bell place or rank #1? Well, because we're in the US. Right? And so folks don't really know a real taco. And so if the folks who are saying the best taco place is Taco Bell, then that's what, you know, folks are gonna get. But it's also interesting, right? As we think about this data, you know, how we're impacted, So let me tell you a very particular story about how this showed up. So I'm going to stop the share just for a moment, but I'm going to then kind of put it back up. I'm going to tell a story, okay? And y'all going to finish it for me. And the reason I do this is to demonstrate how much we are on the same page in ways that we don't think we are. So let me tell the story, yeah. When I was 7, I got my first straight A's. I was so happy. I went back home. I was like, Mommy, mira, tengo A, toda A. You know, it was the first time I got straight A's. I was like so thrilled. I didn't know what a bunch of A's looked like. And my mom was like, oh, sí, you know, hiciste bien, you know, hijo, you did good. She was proud of me. And so I thought everybody was going to react the same way. But then when I went to my block and I went to show my homies, my boys, I'm like, yo, check this out. I got straight A's, man. Look at this, right? I thought they were going to take me the same way, but they didn't. They had a different reaction, right? The way that they took me was, they were like, damn, man, Mike, why you talking about that? Why? It's like you're trying to be all, what am I trying to be? Just because I'm smart and brilliant and I just got straight A's. Put it on the chat. What did they say I was trying to be? Boom. White, trying to be all white, sellout, white. So we begin to deny. You see, yeah, Jessica, right on, man. Cool. I wish they came at me like that, right? Or a coconut, right? There's all these different terminologies. But it's like, people, let's keep it real, right? Let's keep it real, because we are brilliant. We have 525 years of brilliance in our ancestry, in our genes, and the way that we show up today. That's why we are so resilient. That's why we solve problems, right? There's a saying by the scholar and queer Black feminist writer Audre Lorde that says, you can't dismantle the slave master's house with the slave master's tools. See, I don't think like that, but I know where she's coming from. So I also don't want to take that and rip it, because in many ways, she's absolutely right. But what if, and this is the way I think, what if those are the tools that the colonizers took from us, right? So it's no wonder that we do the work the way that we do. So what if those tools belong to our ancestors and were colonized in the first place? It's no wonder when we enter the slave master's home, we know how to use those tools better than the slave master himself. And that's why we are able to be so successful in so many ways. And we have to mark that. We have to mark that, particularly because that is exactly who we are. And so often we fight with it to try to fit in, or to not cause issues, or because we don't want to disappoint someone, as opposed to owning who we are. Man, this incredible freaking people, right? Yes, we developed those tools. And so when I think about institutions, in many ways, I think of institutions like practical museums, except our tools are there for us to use. They're not behind a glass and no toques. No, they're right there in front of us. And then our thinking comes back, right? And our whole selves, our hearts start to connect with our mind and with our body and our spirits. And all our holistic selves starts to see, right, the incredible work that we could do to advance efforts and advance the agendas of Latinx people. And yes, I wanna recognize that too, to the person that was told that they weren't a real Chicano Latino because first gen. Nah, man, we gotta take that, push it to the side. Anything that we do doesn't make us any more or less Latinx. Anybody from any particular nations, from any particular countries who practice a certain way, whether you talk Spanish or don't talk Spanish, whether you identify as Hispanic or Latinx, whether you identify as Chicano or whatever, all that, those are all labels and constructions. We're all of that. except we choose to lean in places. We choose to say, this is politically why I am who I am and why I identify as I do. So let me go ahead and now I'm going to share the screen and put it back up. Yes, I want to give that same shout out to all the women of color. Like, I don't think people understand that without women of color, we would be in so much freaking trouble today. I don't know how to say that louder or clearer, that women of color have been the ones really behind the scenes back then and in the front lines today. Back then, because patriarchy is something else. Man, machismoism is something else. And it's not just limited to Latinx communities. I want us to understand, right? Like, I want to break down post-colonialism, because post-colonialism, usually we talk about it in the post, but post-colonialism is not about the post. Post-colonialism is a rupturing of racism that allows us to see the varieties of racism that exist today that normally were marked as racism, like microaggressions. That's a post-colonial thing. Like implicit bias, that's a post-colonial thing, right? Like micro inequities, like stereotype threat. Those are all post-colonial practices. It's like a nice way of saying, I'm only willing to deal with racism, but if you say it nicely, right? And that's how we then deal with so much that today, because we do it in the context of the norm, which is white supremacist, heteronormative patriarchy. But the thing is that even in indigenous communities, we had two-spirited peoples back in the day. We just didn't knock it. We embraced it. So yes to that system of oppression that exists. And how do we step into that? But how do we also check ourselves? So let me put up the screen. So here we are in the world of COVID with BIPOCs and Latinx people in the front lines. Why? Because we're the essential workers. We're the ones in the fields. We're the ones in education. We're the ones who are the nurses. We are the ones who are the delivery. We are the ones who are the cooks. Then we do it freaking all. That's why I'm telling you, man, with most Latinx people, that's why I be telling people, I'm like, mira, dame un cardo y me deja, tú sabes, con ese cardo, man. I figured it out real quick. I remember growing up, like a lot of my relatives, they knew how to do everything. ¿Quién se va a casar? We got to build them a house. What's wrong with your car? Oh, let me go take a look at that and bring some pieces of metal that had nothing to do with the Toyota, but still put that in there. It was like what we do is so amazing that it still to this day amazes me with respect to what we're able to do, right? We keep putting ourselves at risk because we got to keep our jobs. It's not a privilege. We don't get to say for a lot of our people, you know, and it's not for everyone, for a lot of our people across the US, we don't get to say, you know what, I can't because, you know, my health matters and I don't want to get sick. No, our very survival and ability to live and to support our families and communities depend on it, right? We also live usually in larger households. And let me tell you that there's nothing wrong with that. And sometimes I look at culture today, and let me tell you that, are you familiar with that movie Spanglish with Adam Sandler and Salma Hayek? And it's an older flick, but there was a moment in that movie where the young daughter was like, I need space. And Salma was like, space? What the hell is space? That's what I did when I moved in here. And people started to use things like space. I was like, space? ¿Qué carajo es eso? What do you mean by space? You know, in Puerto Rico and even in New York, man, we're all up each other's grills. Now, I'm not saying that there's nothing wrong with a little bit of space, you know, but I'm saying culturally speaking, the idea of distance is something that we've had to like almost assimilate to in this space where we don't really have space, because back home, we just enter each other's houses. We just go kick it with each other. We always join each other for dinner. We're hanging out in each other's backyards. There's this idea of space is a very Western idea. But we also have poor access to healthcare, in most part, more likely to have conditions because of poor nutrition, education, and as a result of poverty, right? And we're also least likely to seek out medical assistance. Why? I wonder. Historically, because, I don't know, doctors decided that our bodies were, you know, worth experimenting on. So yes, there is a distrust there that is very legitimate. And though we've gotten through and through that in most part, That's something to still think about because it matters still for a lot of cultura. So all these formulated identities is exactly what they are, formulated, and they all relate to relational issues of power and subordination. And I don't want to say sign up for it, but we do. So what does it mean then to walk through something like the census count? Because we understand the benefit that something like that offers to our communities to get more funds for our state. And for, especially when we think about census count and the funds the state receives, and especially this municipality that is Denver, all those go to education, all those go to community not-for-profits, all those go to supporting scholarships, all those goes to advancing and improving healthcare for our communities. So we still have to like hold on to it and walk through it and negotiate and navigate it, but it's also okay to critique and self-identify and self-determine who you are. So here I put up a slide that really kind of looks at this post-colonial whiteness idea, and I place it along the anti-Blackness in particular because we truly have to understand this not only as a framework, but we also have to understand it as a people with respect to who we are today, right? So that we could truly be there for each other today, stand in solidarity. The amount of haterade that I see within Latinx community sometimes to me is astounding, that we can look at each other and love each other and respect each other and give props to each other when we do solid work. It's like, are we trying to advance ourselves to compete for the satisfaction and the qualifications of a dominant culture, or are we doing it to uplift ourselves and uplift our communities? And the more one person comes up, then the more we all come up. And how do we share that and understand what that means within the context, especially of places like education, K-12 and higher ed and beyond? And we rarely talk about Afro-Latinidad. You know how many people are out there who identify as Afro-Latinos that we just think that they're African-American because we're so caught up in this is what African-American or a Black person looks like, including some of our most beloved pop cultural celebrities. But what I want to intersect with race in particular is our role in Black Lives Matters, right? Understanding the anti-Blackness within our communities, yes. And like, this is such a difficult topic. We don't want to address it because not only does it hurt, but it's also real. And it also means confronting a lot of people or challenging with love, I hope. All about the love. I do this work because I have love, because it's important, because we must. And if not, we're going to continue to be divided and conquered. Let me be very real about that strategy as one of absolute colonial and white supremacy. So to understand this, we have to understand that this is all a colonial process, but that we also buy into this concept, right? We accept it and we even fight for it, right? It's a way of identifying ourselves, but it's also a contemporary condition and it shifts from generation to generation. So I came up with this term, right? Multi-generational ideal inheritance, to also demonstrate the way that we pass the trauma down, the way that we pass these issues down to the next generations, and we leave it on them instead of figuring out how do we mitigate and try to stop this and do better by ourselves so that the next generation, they don't have to focus on fighting this so much. They're still going to have to do that to some extent, but generally, they're going to be able to just focus on advancing the lives and the communities of Latinx people across the US and globally. And this is one way we could do that, the power of the purse. When you begin to look at a lot of the data that is out there, I want you to really kind of read this. Latinx households account for a large portion of our spending power in the US. 687.8 billion. I want you to really sit with that number as a way that we have power and influence, right? We're also incredibly influential as contributors to tax revenue. We're also one of the leaders in entrepreneurship in the US, from car garages to investment companies to bodegas, right? to literally taking all our skill sets to restaurants and turning that culturally into a business so that it's not hijacked further by dominant culture, so that when we go into a restaurant, you know, that is grounded in Latinx culture. That's why I really love that one restaurant. I mean, there's a bunch of them, but the one particularly in Westwood called Carlos, because it just not only does it sort of, it was intentional. I met the owner, but the way that they place culture all around, and the way that they own that, and the way they collaborate with other Latinx businesses in that particular community, and the partnership that they have there. But today, man, we live in this fear and we act on that fear. And we have to get away from that fear and actually step up to the conviction of why we do what we do. Now, the media does an incredible, incredible job at feeding people, right? It's like we have several worlds. And through those worlds, especially to the media, people think they come to know us. And then that's when they get a little carried away and make like some comment that is like, yo, yeah, that, you know, usually I would, you know, engage you in a certain way. I can't do that no more because I'm a VP now, so I'm not going to, you know, get in trouble. But just letting you know that you can't be running up around me, you know, making that commentary, not thinking that I might not react or catch you on it, which leads them to this appropriation and insensitivity. Things like Catching Immigrant Day and Latinx themed parties, and the idea of Latinx as gang members and drug dealers and criminals, the way that they sell this narrative on a national scale for neoliberal purposes and to make money, that we're only good for servitude and for food and for landscaping, and that we're also the educators of everything Latinx. But when we look at what the conversation might look like, we see who's at the bottom and who's at the top. But we also see within the context of us having to work together with our African-American Black brothers and sisters and SIBs, because I was called out once by a queer non-gender binary person who said, you know, when you say sister or brother, you leave me out. So they said, call me SIB. That's the gender neutral way of saying brother or sister, or our SIBs, to really address these issues in a collective manner. But when we look at this, look at what Latinos, you know, have to say, man. We are a people that also love this nation. We're a people that also appreciate being here, that think so optimistically, not only within the context of COVID, but also within the context of knowing that we're going to get out of this and that we're still going to find a way forward. When you look at US born and foreign born and the difference between this Latinx, when you think about also race, ethnicity, you also see that, you know, both care about education. Both care about strengthening the nation's economy. Both care about breach insecurity. A lot of them care about immigration and healthcare costs. There's not a lot of difference there. So how do we find then that common ground? And how do we step into the self-implication of these issues? Cesar Chavez said, we cannot seek achievement for ourselves and forget about progress and prosperity for our community. Our ambitions must be broad enough to include the aspirations and needs of others for their sakes, but also for our own. And that's truly how we should be thinking and need to think. Because the moment we start buying into that individualism, buying into that particular Western ideal, that's the moment that we in some ways let go of the fact that we are a collective that needs to understand how to uplift each other, how to help each other persevere, how to help each other come up, how to hold each other when we need some holding, how to come through for each other when we need some coming through. But even more important, how to ask for that support when we need it, because we could be so freaking stubborn and arrogant that we don't know how to say te necesito. I need a little love in my life, right? And that's us culturally validating who we are as a people. So mi gente, I want to leave you with this and then open it up for just the conversation. This is the complexity and nuance of being Latinx in the US. This is the complexity and the nuance of walking through and navigating and negotiating all these different spaces all the time. A lot of times we win, but you know, there are those moments where when we don't do as well, but we know how to get back up. Pero we are a brilliant people. Let's be our best brilliant selves and truly work to uplift each other, not hate on each other. And let me be clear that that is also a white supremacist cultural practice. We may have some of the bodies who practice it, brown and black bodies within Latinx communities who practice it, but it's a white supremacist concept. And I need to make that real clear, because so often we tie that to who we are as gente, but as gente, we are truly, truly some of the most brilliant peoples this earth has to offer for 525 years, not only staying up with things, but thriving and cultivating and creating and amplifying spaces that are not only ours, but where we see each other reflected in the incredible work that we do. And that's no clearer than in the space that we call education. Thank you all so much. Wow. Thank you for trusting me with your time. I'm going to open it up for questions. Joel or Mary, feel free to take it away. I so wish I could be with all y'all like in person. This virtual thing is dope in some ways, but it's like, quiero estar con mi gente, you know?
Yes. Yeah. So Mary, I don't know if you're in the call, if you're still in the call, but we have some time for some questions actually. So either if maybe someone has a question, if you just want to actually unmute yourself and ask the question, that would be fine. But yeah, Mary, I guess, yeah, I'll let you take it away.
Well, you just said it. So yeah, if anyone has questions, feel free to unmute or drop in the chat, and Dr. Benitez will answer your questions.
Yeah, please do. You know, I didn't want to like go like super long, because I always love to leave time for us to have this virtual dialogue. So please, if you have questions, put them up in there. If you